You know, this game was actually a pretty decent surprise. In my last video, which you should definitely watch if you haven't already, I essentially capped things off with saying that I thought Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories was a good time, but didn't really do anything you couldn't find in any other GTA game. I also said I was more or less expecting the same thing with the game that we're discussing today, but to kind of spoil this video a bit, I was actually proven wrong. The game I'm referring to is of course Rockstar's second flagship release for the PSP, Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories, released in October of 2006. This is a pretty wild time for Rockstar, because, well, since the release of GTA 3, we pretty much got a new Grand Theft Auto game every single year after that. Hell, that was actually the 5th Grand Theft Auto game we received that console generation, which, when you kind of compare that to what we get nowadays, is pretty funny to think about. And why wouldn't Rockstar continue to drop games like this? Vice City Stories was another in a long line of games that sold great, reviewed well, and had a number of awards attached to it. It's a tale that I've told quite a few times across this series of videos, and this game is really no different. So given that pretty much everything that was released during this time was seen as a landmark title, it's no surprise that the Grand Theft Auto community grew at such a rapid pace during this time. Every game from that period had a ton of discourse that surrounded it during its release, and are looked back upon in very different ways nowadays. GTA 3 seems to be seen as the biggest innovator of the group, even though it's pretty much universally agreed upon that the game has also aged the worst. Vice City is often held up as having the best overall vibe that any game in the series has had so far, and a lot of people out there actually hold it up as their favorite overall game. San Andreas is the one that typically gets the most amount of love from the community, and come on, just think about how many memes and gaming-related events and rumors surround this one. It's simply massive. Liberty City Stories was Rockstar's first attempt at bringing the 3D GTA formula to a handheld, and it would go on to become the highest-selling PSP game of all time. So that brings us to Vice City Stories, a game that, in my opinion, honestly doesn't really get the credit that it deserves. I rarely ever hear people talk about this game, and if they do, it's usually lumped into Liberty City Stories in a way that doesn't really highlight what this game in particular does well. And you know, I'm really curious as to why that is. Clearly people have played this game since it was the second highest selling game on the PSP, and clearly people at least enjoyed it to some degree because it reviewed well and you never hear anything bad about the game. But I also don't really hear anything at all, I guess. I mean, me personally, growing up, I always thought this game was just a port of Vice City to the PSP, so I never really had too much interest until I started doing research for this marathon. I just assumed that that was the reason that it was mostly glossed over. But having now played it for myself, I think this game is actually pretty damn good, and in some ways, does some things that you don't really see in any other Grand Theft Auto game that were a complete surprise to me. So I wanted to take a chance again to talk to you guys about my experience, really in the hopes that if you're a fan of the series and haven't given this one a try, that you do, because I think there's a ton of fun to be had here. Before we get into the thick of this video though, I'll give you guys a bit of a heads up again. I am playing the PS2 version of this game on an emulator for this video, since there isn't a legitimate way of getting this game outside of a resale copy. I decided to go with the PS2 version since I heard it's essentially the same as the PSP version, but prettier, runs with a more consistent frame rate, and has some additional bonus content. No multiplayer mode though, which, again, not that big of a deal to me. The PS2 version is probably the best way of going about playing this game nowadays in my opinion, so there you go. And here we are, another quick video for you guys today, because I mean, there's really only so many ways that I can explain the mission structure, how you shoot and drive around in Grand Theft Auto. It's mostly the same shit. That being said, we do have a little bit to talk about today though, so without further ado, this is my review for Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories. So let's start our discussion with the presentation. It's the same as Vice City, what do you expect? And now on to the story. I have to say that it's actually pretty... Alright, fine. Well, that's not entirely true. Yeah, at face value, many of the things about Vice City Stories looks like it was ripped straight from Vice City. The character design, most of the animations, the overall visual aesthetic is basically the same quality, more or less. The performance was still pretty solid for the most part here too, aside from the weird occasional quirk where it just seemed like no vehicles would spawn anywhere I was. It was a very strange occurrence to me, and almost made Vice City look like a ghost town at times, but thankfully that only happened once in a while. And finally, since a lot of the cast from Vice City reprise their roles here again, the performances are once again top notch. Though while we are talking about the audio, there is one thing I want to give a special shout out to: the soundtrack. I'm not gonna lie, going into this game, I definitely expected the same soundtrack that we had in the original Vice City, And I was honestly fine with that, since I think that game still has probably the best lineup of songs that we've seen this series put together. But honestly, Vice City Stories could just about give that game a run for its money. This soundtrack, once again,
fucks.
And is again a fantastic representation of the early 80s. You got artists such as The Cure, Depeche Mode, New Order, Rick James, Earth, Wind & Fire, Marvin Gaye, Kiss, The Scorpions, Rat, Judas Priest, Motley Crue, Dio, Hall & Oates, Pat Benatar, and the fucking GOAT himself, Phil Collins. These guys just straight up did this shit again, man. What can you say? I can't compliment the music in this game enough, especially because of how much I love music from this decade. It's some seriously good shit. And then when it comes to the story for Vice City Stories, it's actually also surprisingly pretty decent. We have another prequel on our hands, taking place a few years before the events of Vice City kick off. This time around, you play as Vic Vance, who's a corporal in the US Army. He enlisted to essentially help bring some money for his family, since he is in the unfortunate circumstance of having some family members either be sick or be Lance Vance from Vice City. Yeah, he returns in this game, except they made him even more batshit insane this time. Not too far into the game, Vic actually gets discharged from the military due to his commanding officer essentially having him do some bitch work that the army isn't exactly thrilled to hear about. And then it becomes your pretty standard GTA story after that, of our main character trying to make their living in the criminal underground of society, while we also have our antagonists occasionally fuck with us. It's a formula that works, and honestly, I kind of expect it to be the cookie cutter going forward, which is fine since GTA has always had the goal of being an entertaining story first, and everything else comes second. And with that in mind, I think Vice City Stories does a pretty decent job of that. I think there is a decent amount of humor here, and while I don't think it reached the heights of San Andreas when it came to its message or any of its jokes, I did think it was overall fun. The characters in the story are the main reason for this. The ones that return from Vice City I think are given a bit more personality here, especially Lance. He's like the most insane person in this game, and he steals the show every single time he pops up. We also have some fun side characters too, like the music manager Barry, who has a good back and forth with Phil Collins. Yeah, that's right, Phil Collins is a character in this game too. I'm not shitting you. Honestly, all the interactions I have with them are far and away my favorite in this game. We also have some pretty fun run-ins with Rainey. And if you think the discourse surrounding GTA 6 daring to have a female protagonist was bad, I don't even want to think about what would be said about this character if this game was released today. Though one character I was actually a little disappointed with was our protagonist, Vic. I initially thought him being a military guy that was forced to operate as a criminal, we'd get some pretty interesting interactions, whether it be played for laughs or maybe even exploring how some military people have to readjust to society. Either would have been fine with me, but Vic doesn't really do that much. He's got this kind of random romance with a side character that seems a little unnecessary, and he usually is just played as a straight man for some of the more zany characters, which kind of works, I guess, but he just comes off as a bit boring because of it. He doesn't really have the charisma of a character like CJ, so he just kind of falls flat in most situations. Overall though, the story and presentation do a pretty decent job of keeping me engaged, at least a little bit more than Liberty City Stories did. And you know, the same could honestly be said about the gameplay too, which, yeah, let's get into that next. So when it comes to the gameplay, I think it would be best to quickly squash most of the things that are basically the same as they were in Liberty City Stories, so we can get into the real meat of this conversation. So driving and most basic controls, the same. The open world of Vice City, kind of the same idea as Liberty City Stories, where a few things are different, but it's like 95% the same. Mission design is structurally the same, but I think does a few things better than Liberty City Stories, and a couple things better than Vice City actually, that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So what exactly is different? Well, let's talk about some of the basic controls first. So while we don't get all the fluidity changes that San Andreas brought to the table, we do at least get to see the re-implementation of swimming. With the game still having the two main islands segmented, there was a compromise that needed to be made though. We see this through the usage of a stamina meter, preventing players from traveling to the other side of the map early. I think this is fine. I mean, it does kind of take away from some of the potential mystery of the map since there really isn't anything to explore underwater, but hey, it's certainly better than not having it at all. The control for a lot of the combat has improved now too. It seems like now when you actually use the lock-on aim, instead of prioritizing the closest potential target, it will instead favor hostile enemies. Which is a small change, but it was definitely noticeable from what I was experiencing in Liberty City Stories, let me tell you. You can also grapple people in this game, assuming you give a shit about the melee combat. Please don't give a shit about the melee combat. I think one of the coolest changes is the new Empire building feature. This is honestly an awesome feature, and while it may be a bit underutilized, I still think it gives Vice City Stories its own sense of identity. Essentially imagine it as a mix of the property buying from Vice City and the gang warfare from San Andreas. There are a number of illegitimate businesses around Vice City that you could choose to essentially invade that are run by rival gangs. By destroying their vehicles, you are sent a wave of enemies to kill before going into the building to destroy all of their assets. After that, you can purchase the property, and then you get to choose what kind of business you want to run out of it. You can have it be a protection racket, you could become a loan shark, you could be a smuggler or a robber. Hell, you can start a prostitution or a drug ring if you want to. There's a lot of options here, and they're all super duper scummy. I love it, it's great. Each property also allows you to decide if you want it to be either small, medium, or big time, offering higher passive payouts for each. They also come with optional missions that you can do to increase said payouts. They're a little on the copy and paste side, but it's some extra content for you. After your property has been sitting for a while, you can also have rival gang attacks come by and try to take your property, but if you collect all the properties in the game, they can't come after you anymore. Honestly, this is a really fucking cool system. I really wish this came back in other Grand Theft Auto games. It's not perfect, like I wish the missions were a little bit less copy and paste, but this is a really cool ass idea that was done just good enough that it kept me engaged throughout my entire playthrough. Speaking of the missions, these are pretty damn good in this game too. Nothing on the level of San Andreas, but I would say on par with Vice City was doing at the very least, and in some cases even surpassing it. Let me give you a few examples, like the mission where you commandeer an attack helicopter, or the mission where you try to hit a guy in the dick with a golf ball in the driving range, or hell, how about the fucking Dawn of the Dead style mission where you shoot zombies in the mall with a shotgun? That one kicked ass, honestly. But by far the best missions in this game are the ones that you do for the legend himself, Phil Collins. Yep, he's a quest giver in this game, and what an awesome quest line this was. So after you save this beautiful British bastard from being gunned down on a golf course by the Forelli gang, you have to stop his sound check from being sabotaged by these same gang members, which surely means they must be classified as a terrorist organization for doing something so heinous. When the concert eventually begins, they even try to drop lights on the stage to kill Phil Collins, which you have to stop. And your reward for doing this quest, outside of like, the normal payout, is a virtual performance of In the Air Tonight. I'm not fucking kidding. What a weird part of the game to have here. Like, this mission just seriously pauses for like 2 minutes so you can watch Phil Collins shuffle around on stage while this song plays. And yes, you get to watch him do the drum fill. I am so here for this. There's also a lot more optional stuff this time around too, which is honestly where I think the Stories games shine the most in my opinion. You got all the optional quests for the Empire buildings, you've got the new Beach Patrol minigame giving you a reason to go to that part of the map now. Of course, all the stuff you can expect from previous games like the Vigilante missions, the ambulance missions, etc, etc. There's a ton of additional stuff here, so much so that it can easily overtake the playtime that Vice City offered, even if you only try to experience a little bit of it. So there is no doubt that I definitely enjoyed my time with Vice City Stories, and I think it's a pretty damn good game. But do I think it's better than the original Vice City? That's where I'm gonna have to say no, unfortunately. There are some things that Stories definitely does better, such as having a bit more variety in the missions, having more side content, and updating the gameplay to be slightly more modern. Unless you're like me and prefer the changes in the Definitive Edition of Vice City, of course. However, I think I much prefer the cast of characters that the original Vice City has. I also think the property buying might be more fun overall, since you actually have unique missions for each. And since Vice City was the game to do the 80s aesthetic and introduce us to the map first, I feel like that game had a bigger impact on me overall. Either way, you still can't go wrong playing Vice City Stories. It's a very good game. I enjoyed it more than 3 or Liberty City Stories at least, but I also do see some of the areas where the game falls a little bit short in my eyes. I would still probably recommend this game to anyone who, again, has enjoyed the PS2 trilogy and is looking for more of the same thing. The game doesn't do a ton to stand out, but what it does do is just enough that I think it might be worth your time. Give it a try, and then maybe someday Rockstar will be merciful and give us a proper re-release. Wishful thinking, I know. But that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving it a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.